Well, eelgrass is a really neat plant. It's very common around Cape Cod. It grows in the bays and offshore. And it's actually, most people aren't familiar with it because they can't see it. It grows underwater. Shellfishermen are very familiar with eelgrass because they often shellfish near the eelgrass beds.
But that's where you find the shellfish.
A lot of shellfish are in the eelgrass beds, that's true. And if you do a lot of boating or diving, you're familiar with eelgrass. But for most people, all they know of eelgrass is the stuff that washes up on shore. This is some eelgrass rack. People collect it. They use it in their garden for mulch. Joan of the Wampanoag was telling me that foodstuffs used to be stored in pits using this eelgrass. And even the early colonists used to use eelgrass in their mattresses.
Wow.
So this is an eelgrass rack. Eelgrass is actually not a seaweed. This is a seaweed. This is a rockweed that was used in the clam bake. But this is a very primitive plant or organism. Eelgrass is really a higher plant. It's much like the grass in your yard. And here's what eelgrass looks like. It has very long green leaves. It has rhizomes and roots, just like the grass in your yard does. And if you were to come during the right time of year, you'd even find flowers on eelgrass.
Wow.
It's a flowering plant. It flowers underwater and produces seeds. And just like the grass that grows in your lawn, it spreads by putting out new shoots on the runner, or it'll produce seeds that'll colonize new areas. And so in many bays around Cape Cod, if you could roll back the tides and look at the bottom, it would be covered with this eelgrass. Eelgrass has disappeared from a lot of bays on Cape Cod, including Waquoit Bay. And in this bay, like many other bays, it used to grow right up here, right up close to the bay in deep water, all the way to the mouth. And if you go to the chart that we have up on the graphic, eelgrass in the 1950s used to cover much of Waquoit Bay. And then beginning in the 1960s and through the 70s and 80s, it gradually disappeared. First, it disappeared from the deeper areas in the upper parts of the bay. Then it disappeared from all of the bay except very near the mouth. And what happened was that water quality declined in Waquoit Bay. And there are a number of factors that are affecting eelgrass, and Dan asked about disturbance. In some bays, stirring up of sediments by water skiing, boat propellers, chains on anchors, and so forth. There's enough of that activity to actually remove eelgrass. But a bigger problem that we see in many bays is pollution, particularly nitrogen and nutrients from land use. So in answer to Dan's question, we both have physical disturbances that are removing eelgrass and causing its loss, and we have chemical changes in the water that's causing eelgrass to disappear. And the mechanism of that is eelgrass is very sensitive to light. It needs a good water transparency to grow. You can see these nice, beautiful green leaves here. In clean water, eelgrass can actually grow down to 20 or 30 feet around Cape Cod. But when the water is turbid, if it's stirred up, if sediments are stirred up in the water, or if you have a lot of eutrophication, what we call eutrophication, too much nutrients in the water, you start having a lot of algae growing. And the algae in the water shades out the eelgrass. In many bays, we have the water turning green. We have algae growing on the bottom, and this accumulation of algae shades out the eelgrass. And in the diagram over here, we have a model of what the groundwater on Cape Cod looks like. We live on a pile of sand here in Waquoit, and people have septic systems in their backyard. When they flush the toilet, it doesn't go to a sewer. It goes to a leaching system in their backyard. And in this system here, we're trying to simulate what happens when you flush a toilet and the water goes in the ground. All water in the ground on Cape Cod eventually flows to the ocean. And in this model here, you can see the plume slowly moving underground through the system. And in real life, it's traveling at 1 or 2 feet a day. And here we're accelerating it. But you'll see this plume of wastewater traveling through the groundwater, and eventually it will enter Waquoit Bay. And when this plume of wastewater enters the bay, it carries with it a lot of nutrients, and those nutrients are stimulating the growth of algae, and that growth of algae is shading out the eelgrass and causing its disappearance.
So that's why we're seeing eelgrass here disappearing.
That's exactly right.
Now, you mentioned that, and this is true here on Cape Cod, a lot of people, most people have don't have a town sewer to hook up to. It's septic tanks.
Yes.
And a lot of people think with putting in new septic tanks that addresses the nitrogen problem, but that's not always the case, is it?
No, not at all. Septic systems are designed to remove bacteria and to prevent threats to human health, because we don't want the bacteria to be traveling through the groundwater into the bay and contaminating the shellfish. But what they don't do is remove nitrogen from the wastewater. And you need a more sophisticated treatment system than your conventional septic system. And so there's a lot of interest on the Cape about promoting these alternative wastewater systems to better remove nitrogen from people's homes.
We have a question from Kings Mountain Middle School in North Carolina. And this question is, are there any invasive plant or animal species that affect the native species?
Yeah, in the case of eelgrass, there's a plant that grows around here called green fleece. And it looks like fingers. It's a green algae. It was introduced from Europe or possibly from the Pacific, possibly with some shellfish that were introduced here. And it's been spreading throughout the East Coast. It occurs in a lot of the bays here, including Waquoit Bay, and it competes with eelgrass. They both need sunlight. They both live on the bottom, and they're both battling for that little piece of space to get the sun to grow and live.
Now, you mentioned a few things that are going on here that are destroying the eel beds. What do we do?
Well, it depends on what the problem. Every bay has its own story, and it depends on whether or not you have a lot of physical disturbances. In some areas, we recommend having areas where you don't have water skiing or jet skiing because there is an eelgrass bed there, or not to allow disturbances or mooring fields in those areas. When it comes to nitrogen loading, it requires management of septic systems. And towns are looking at having either small wastewater treatment plants or larger ones to handle all this wastewater from people's homes.
Joe Costa, thank you so much.
Thank you, Mindy.